All right, welcome everyone. This is our new podcast slash show, Understanding Platonism. Me, Keith, and I'm here with Eric Orwell. How you doing, Eric? If you'd like to give a brief introduction and your background knowledge of Platonism, and yeah, why I picked you to be the co-host of this.
Well, in the circles that I've been in online, I'm kind of known as the Plato guy. I run some Plato reading groups. In one form or another, I've always talked about Platonic philosophy online. And basically, I just love it. I wouldn't call myself an expert. I don't have any academic credentials, but I have read all the dialogues, a lot of the Neoplatonic corpus, and I just really can't get enough of it. I also believe, like, deeply that Platonism is a complete philosophical system and does a better job than any modern theory of ontology, metaphysics, and that we need it in terms of a worldview for today, and also in terms of like reconsidering how we engage in philosophy. So
Yeah, and the first topic we've chosen, we're gonna break these episodes into specific topics related to all things Platonism. But you chose as the first topic the three hypostases. Now, before we get into exactly what they are, I guess the question would be, why do you think that that's a good place to begin?
well, when I approach a new philosophical system, I like the broadest possible overview. The three hypostases, as outlined, I guess, first in a very explicit form by Plotinus, are the one, intellect, or the forms, and soul. Of course, there are other aspects of this outside of these main three categories, but this really contains the essence of the Platonic worldview and ontology. It is a layered ontology. You know, people often think about Platonism in terms of a dualism of the realm of forms and then, you know, the sensible world around us. But that's kind of the wrong way of looking at it. Really, there are these three kinds of real beings: souls at the lowest level, the forms in the middle, and then the one and the henads, if we're going to follow Iamblichus and Proclus, within that first hypostasis. So it gives us not only a big kind of summary overview of the kinds of things that Platonism postulates, its ontology, it also shows us how those connect. Whereas if we started with like the theory of forms, we wouldn't necessarily see how the forms connect to the one or how the forms connect to souls. And it is really a kind of integral system. So I think that big, broad overview is going to be helpful.
Yeah, so, Platonism is a system of, I guess you could say, qualified non-dualism, right? There isn't this sharp dualism, like a separate world of a lesser, like physical material world, and then a perfect world of forms. But rather, the best way to understand it maybe is through emanation, like the analogy that's often used both by Plato and later Platonists is, the rays of the sun, like the sun as an analogy for the one, or the idea of the good. The Greeks at the time had this idea that the sun didn't lose any of its energy by emanating light, right? And that was often an analogy they used for the one, that without partaking or without losing any of itself, that it emanates this creative energy. And this this goes all the way downwards. So these are sort of, you have kind of intermediaries all the way down, right? So the question is like, how do we get from, the perfect one, the idea of the good, how do you get to that, to, defective matter, to a world of decay and death? And that's really why you need these intermediary hypostases, right?
Yes, yeah, that's a general principle in Neoplatonism. There are always midpoints. As the Eleatic Stranger articulates the dialectical method in The Sophist, the key to finding the true types, the true kinds in reality, is dividing up at the midpoint. Plato also says elsewhere that dialectics is about dividing nature up at the joints. So it's finding these true dividing points, but there is the tendency always for them to kind of take place at these perfect mediums. So this is also connected to the idea of logos in general. Logos is not just an account or a logic, a system of rational explanation. It's also measure. So arriving at an account of things, broadly speaking, is going to be at the same time kind of putting them in their due measure. And this idea of like a midpoint establishing these divisions is very important. So yeah, there are always middle terms with any spectrum in Neoplatonism.
So there's two more kind of general principles here, right? One is that the higher generates the lower in a way that the lower is totally reliant on the higher for its existence, but the higher isn't reliant at all for the lower. So, nous doesn't need soul, but soul needs nous, like if you want to go up through the hypostases. But also, another principle would be that things seek to return to their origin, right? So the lower is seeking to ascend and return back to the higher principle that generated it, right? So those are kinds of general principles of Platonic ontology, right?
Yes. The idea of the independence of the forms in a qualified sense is universally accepted. They're certainly more independent than souls are, and certainly more independent than bodies are. Whether there isn't some kind of feedback cycle is up for debate, and in later Neoplatonism, especially in like Christian Neoplatonism with Scotus Erigena, that view is kind of reconsidered, and perhaps there's more of a reciprocity between the participated and the participating. And there is a notion already in Proclus, though, that the higher levels of reality contain causally what is emanated in a more kind of extended and disparate way, or extended way. So they contain in themselves what is in lower things in a more concentrated form. So saying they're independent of that which they emanate, it can be a little bit misleading. It's not that the forms could exist without that which is real in souls. That which is most real in souls or in bodies, which is their kind of formal content, their actual intelligibility, what gives them the structure that they really have. What is real in the lower entities is already there in a concentrated form in the higher. So in a sense, you could say they are independent, though, yes.
Mm-hmm. So the first principle of all is the one, or the idea of the good that Plato identifies in the Republic. So how do we get from the one to the second hypostasis of nous? Or why is that shift necessary?
Well, yeah, this is the problem of the one and the many. Clearly, we see many things around us, and yet in explanatory terms, it is inevitable that you bring your principles back to a single first principle, because, and this is an argument that Proclus makes explicit in the Elements of Theology, if you have two or more first principles that you're positing, do those first principles have anything in common? If they do, then that commonality needs to be explained in terms of a yet higher first principle. So if you want to say that like reality is fundamentally composed of this set of quantum fields, it's like, okay, do those quantum fields have something in common or not? That which they have in common is not something that is within any of those fundamental principles. Therefore, a more fundamental principle has to be invoked to explain their commonalities. So you need that idea of the one, and we need to explain the existence of the many somehow or another. And so basically there's only one good way of doing this, which is to take the features in reality that are most universal the commonalities that have the widest extension and place them at a more fundamental level in your ontological scheme. So the one has to be presumed no matter what in any system as the highest principle of explanation. If you try to avoid that, like I said, you run into this argument of Proclus, what do your first principles have in common? You're going to have to invoke a higher principle. So the one in some form has to extend to everything. The one is that first hypostasis. It must extend to anything that we can talk about, because any individual body, any bit of matter in the world has some kind of unity. Otherwise, it couldn't even be an object of semantic reference. We couldn't talk about something unless we're talking about some one thing. Oneness is a minimum criteria of existence. And indeed, oneness is that which grants existence at its most fundamental level to all things. The higher levels necessarily not only extend further than lower levels. So like first principles apply to everything, second principles apply to most things, tertiary principles apply to less things. This is also referred to in Neoplatonism as Proclus's rule. But they not only extend further, they also, in their furthest extensions, must act as the kind of ground on which all secondary and tertiary principles are applied. So in order to apply particular formal properties, the entity, the participant in the relationship, is first going to have a unity that acts as the substrate of those properties. So there's this kind of, the top extends all the way to the bottom and provides a ground for participation of all lower level principles and qualities. And so before we get to the forms themselves, in Iamblichus and Proclus and all later Neoplatonists, there is this distinction between the one itself, which is treated as a kind of exempt, transcendent, reality that's totally ineffable. We can't exactly treat it as an intelligible principle itself. It's super intelligible and super essential. It doesn't have an essence that can be defined. We have to point to it kind of necessarily. This is apophatic theology in essence. You can't avoid speculating about the ground of things that is beyond any other principle of explanation. Like if you could fully explain the first principle of all things, that would be in terms of other explanatory principles. And so you'd be engaged in a certain form of circular reasoning. The first principle of all things has to be ineffable. But then immediately after that, Iamblichus and Proclus following him posit the monad and the indefinite dyad. So when people think about the one, or to hen in the Greek, they think
and
kind
this
of
is also,
yeah.
I mean, there is a claim that Plato also posited these principles, the one and the indefinite. I think Aristotle attributed it to him, right?
Yes, he did. Whether those occur in the first hypostasis in the system of hypostases is kind of the part that's up for debate, but it does seem like Plato had all of these concepts. Exactly how they fell in his system is very difficult to determine, so I think it's safer sort of to take Proclus as a guide. Proclus, I would say, is kind of like the encapsulator and systematizer of Neoplatonic philosophy. Plotinus generates a lot of ideas, but he's kind of a pioneer doing that, and so there are a lot of loose ends and things that don't exactly neatly fit together. Proclus resolves a lot of those issues, following his teacher Syrianus and following, Iamblichus. Ultimately, there's kind of a Porphyrian line of Neoplatonism and an Iamblichian line of Neoplatonism. Ultimately, the Iamblichian line ends up being more influential. Not that the followers of Iamblichus, didn't take what Porphyry had to say to heart. They did. It's just there's these two main branches, essentially. So when we're talking about the within the first hypostasis, following Proclus, there will be the monad and the indefinite dyad in that first hypostasis. That is the principle of limitation and the principle of the unlimited. These are certainly Pythagorean ideas. Neo-Pythagoreans talk about them. The monad is different from the one, or tohen. Tohen, the one in the broadest sense, is beyond a principle of limitation. It's beyond the number one. The one isn't simply just one thing, right? It's beyond any category. It is this totally ineffable, transcendent type of thing. The monad, though, is the principle of limitation. And opposed to that is the principle of the unlimited. So the monad, limitation, or peros, and then the indefinite dyad, unlimitation, or apeiron. They combine in various ways to produce the various henads, or specific principles of unity. These henads are necessary for Proclus to support the existence of the various forms. So each of the forms, and now we'll have to kind of dip into the second hypostasis to start explaining them. The various forms are characterized by the way in which they participate of each other, and the way, yeah.
The second hypostasis is nous, right? Which
right.
There's I've seen different translations of that. I guess the most common is intellect, right? I saw William Ralph Inge, who has a great book about the philosophy of Plotinus. He translates it as spirit, actually. But nous encompasses a lot of things, right? But this is, when people talk about the realm of the forms, this would be located in nous, right? But it's not just like the static sort of abode of the forms. There's also something active in it, because I think Plato suggests that nous itself has knowledge, and nous has intelligence, wisdom. So it's not just the known, like the objective forms that are held up in this nous, but it's also a knowing of the forms. I think it's also identified with being itself at some points. So nous is being, it's the realm of the forms, it's intelligence, intellect. So I guess it's what a lot of people would identify with God, right? And I think Plato and Plotinus do at different times call, when they say God, they're identifying it with nous. Now at other times it gets complicated, because at sometimes Plotinus will use God for the one, and then at sometimes he'll use it for nous. But I guess when we think of the theistic conception, right, the idea of the one is a lot more apophatic. It's a lot more, like you said, ineffable. It's like Brahman in Hinduism or something. Like there's no category that applies to it. There's no division. There's no attributes. Whereas nous is being, and it's kind of similar to, it's kind of a combination of Plato and Aristotle, in that Aristotle has the thought thinking itself, like the unmoved mover. That's kind of the Platonic idea of nous, right?
Yes. I think, strictly speaking, Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover, his concept of God, is the bottom of the realm of nous, the bottom of the second hypostasis. And we can get into why. The confusion about the sort of two gods, right? The intellectual God, or demiurge, and then the transcendent, unific God, or God simply, is explained sort of using the concept of the henads and the notion of the serai, or divine series. So the way the henads work, there is a correspondence between each of the henads and the higher forms. So within each hypostasis, starting with the henads, there is a mirrored fractal representation of the whole hierarchy within each. So the henads move from the fewer and simpler unities to the more manifold and more complex unities. The forms likewise start from the highest, simplest, which the first member would be being itself, Sometimes this is also identified with number, like by Iamblichus in a kind of Pythagoreanizing vein, but I think it's fair enough to identify that not as countable mathematical number, but a kind of higher underlying numericity that Pythagoras, I think, was actually pointing to. I don't think that Pythagoras held...
Are you saying the forms would be identified with numbers?
In a way, they would be identified by Iamblichus and his followers with kind of the principal that's underlying number.
That's also a claim that Aristotle made about Plato, which has been subject of a lot of debate and interpretation, that at one point Aristotle actually says that Plato identified the forms with number.
Right, but it's not number in the sense of the countable integers that Greek math recognized. It is the principle of differentiation that follows number or underlies number, right? So there is a number of forms that is discrete. Otherwise, we can't talk about multiple forms. A multitude of different kinds is visible with the forms before it's visible in mathematical quantity. So the number that is represented in the realm of forms is beyond mathematical number. So there are kind of different senses of number. Just like the monad means, it just means the number 1, and dyad just means the number 2. But when we're talking in the first hypostasis about the monad and the indefinite dyad, we are not talking about the numbers 1 and 2. We're talking about kind of their underlying principles, also the underlying principles of everything else. So the henads have a kind of multitude within them that follows this same kind of pyramidal structure. The highest henad corresponds to the highest form, which will be being or number itself. And then after that, the kind of second place henad will correspond with the second place form, and so forth. And that series begins with the particular henad. In a sense, it always begins with the one itself. All series, just like all rays from the sun, converge into the sun itself. So these series begin with the one, go through a henad, or a kind of unity, in the first hypostasis. In the second hypostasis, they correspond to a particular intelligible, and that intelligible then is correspondent with an effluence of intelligibility or life. The second hypostasis is also broken up into a cycle of 3 phases, being named after the first member, life, which is the procession of being, and then intellect, strictly speaking, being, life, intellect. So that first being corresponds to a first life, corresponds to a first intellect, and so forth with the second, third, fourth, and this sort of thing. Now, you'll have the exact same process in soul. So within soul, there will be a first soul. Soul is the third hypostasis. That first soul corresponds with the first form, corresponds with the first henad. So these series cut through all of the hypostases. And this is why that concept of the two gods is so confusing for people. Because in one sense, it seems like this bizarre polytheism. In another sense, though, the nature of the divine is distributed through these levels, and we're seeing one and the same divinity in all of its representations. But this does have kind of polytheistic implications in that the number of the henads, the aspects of unity, have their own unique series that are characterized most appropriately by particular names. So particular names capture, notions of divinity, capture aspects of divinity. And we need that multitude in order to fully kind of comprehend the nature of the one. Even though we can't fully comprehend it, it's better to have a kind of multi-aspectual notion of divinity. And I think that's how the polytheism really plays in. It's a multi-aspect monism, or monotheism, you might even say. Proclus does call the one itself the first God and God simply. So that's not to say that there aren't other aspects of God which are more partial than the one itself. And they're like in the Greek myths, when Zeus comes down and interacts with mortals, Neoplatonists would explain that as the action of a particular daimon or high-level soul in the divine series of Zeus. So we call daimonical appearances the appearance of divinity in the form of a particular soul in our domain. We call that by the name of the series, which is derived ultimately from the Henad. So Zeus, the real Zeus, is one of the Henads, but that real Henadic Zeus has an intelligible, intellectual, and soul counterpart by which we know him. So that's a little bit on that, the two gods. The demiurge specifically, though, is kind of a representation of this aspect of divinity in the realm of forms, because that's where we make contact with the realm of forms. The demiurge is actually at the bottom of the realm of forms. So he's in the intellect phase. So being, the intelligibles, are kind of like the being of the forms themselves. That's them as they are in themselves. Itself in itself is the Platonic phrase for those intelligibles. The life is their multiplication. Intellect is a reverting cycle. So the demiurge reflects back cyclically on all of these forms that have already been kind of seminally diversified through the life phase, and he kind of then holds the seeds of their further emanation at the next level of being. So that's Aristotle's thought thinking itself, I would say, and that is the Platonic demiurge at the bottom of the second hypostasis. He makes contact with the third.
I've seen it argued that the demiurge is nous, that it is the second hypostasis. Because Plato says that the demiurge is eternal, whereas the third hypostasis, like the world soul, that's in time. And I think Plotinus also says that the demiurge creates the world soul. So would it be correct to identify them as one and the same, nous and the demiurge?
I think it'd be more correct to say that the demiurge is the intellectual phase of nous. And I do think there is a good reason to have that being, life, intellect, trichotomy within the second hypostasis. So this is the aspect of the realm of forms that gathers all of the forms together, reverts upon itself, and in a singular mental act. And that's like a knowing act. And the knower and the known should be distinguished in some sense. So the intelligibles are the known. They're also higher. In all things instrumental or teleological in Neoplatonism, the instrument or the pursuer of a goal is subordinate to the goal itself. So you already referenced the general principle that all things seek their own productive cause as their good. So we came from demiurgic intellect in a sense, or we came from the world soul, and to the world soul, and above that to demiurgic intellect we want to return. So that's true for all instrumental tasks. So the knower wants to know the known to return to its source, just like the demiurge reflects on the realm of intelligibles to kind of return to his own proper source, and that is his good and his end, to reflect on his source and return in a sense to his source. That's what intellect does. It reverts upon the intelligible. But of course, between that, as we've already talked about, there has to be a middle point. There has to be that which moves and proceeds from that which is abiding and static and eternal being. Not that the rest of it isn't eternal. The whole second hypostasis is within eternity. There is no time in the second hypostasis. But we need that procession, that atemporal procession, in order then to have the reversion. So that's, I think, the proper place of the demiurge, the bottom of the second hypostasis. There is, though, an account in Proclus's commentary on the Cratylus of how the demiurge kind of consumes Phanes, who is the first god that's visible within the intelligible realm. So this can get very complicated. The demiurge is equated with Zeus. Proclus identifies the demiurge with the name Zeus, but there are different aspects of Zeus, right? So demiurgic Zeus, like strictly speaking, is that bottom of this second hypostasis. But in his act of reversion, and metaphorically, he consumes Phanes, or the god of the intelligible forms themselves, and so then assumes his mantle and title. And so in a sense, the demiurgic act is distributed atemporally through the second hypostasis, and in another sense, in like a seminal sense, already back in the realm of Henads themselves. So it's there's a kind of relativism in Platonic ontology where a thing isn't just like at one static point in the hierarchy. It depends on what aspect of it you're trying to capture. In its kind of strictly speaking, most basic sense, the demiurge is the revertive function within the realm of forms that gathers all the forms together and prepares them for their next level of creation. But in a wider sense, there's always some way in which you can kind of extend that function through to the other aspects, because that is a property of the forms, that they all reflect one another. Each of the forms contains all of them, but in a signature particular proportion.
It's not really clear to me why you can't, that Plato isn't just identifying the demiurge with nous. Like you seem to be making this, you're almost making the demiurge more like the world soul, in that there's kind of more of an activity in the demiurge. But seems like the picture presented is like the demiurge creates the universe in the image of the original nous intellect, that's himself. And like you were touching on this Aristotelian idea of like thought thinking itself, it seems like that's what nous is intellect comprehending the forms like eternally. There's no change within nous. So yeah, why can't you just identify the demiurge with nous? Why do you have to use this kind of language of like the lowest end of nous?
Because without that revertive recollecting function, you don't have a distinction between the knower and the known. And it's not that this distinction is absolute or fundamental, but we need categories to separate out what we're talking about by the intellect that is the knower and the intelligibles that are the known. Also, there is the problem that if you wanted to put all of the second hypostasis into just the demiurge, like one eternal divine mind, it would have a kind of singularity that would not offer this kind of multi-aspectual view of the divine, where the other gods besides Zeus wouldn't then reflect in their own particular way here. Everything would kind of converge on the one divine mind, and there wouldn't be a plurality. And I think you do need that plurality, because what is this, like the characteristic of divinity fundamentally is its unific property. The one and the good are equated, right? That first hypostasis, one isn't simply tohen, it's also the good. I forget the Greek term for goodness. But so all unification, qua a unification, is a good, and what is divine in things is that which holds them together, acts as that substrate of their being in other respects. So there's a multitude of Henads because there are multiple aspects of unity. It's not it's not just an intellectual unification. It's not just a mental unification that is affected. There's also the aspect of unification that has more of that effluent, preceding life component. So like when you create, in our world, like when you have children, there is, I mean, yes, it's a separation in one sense, but it's also creating a broader unified being. And that isn't exactly captured in thought thinking itself. Like you can see how in some sense it is, but I think there's something to be said for being able to identify these multiple aspects of unity, which means the multiple henads. And if you smush them all together into one divine mind and don't allow them to have kind of an independent being, then they aren't the itself in itself that Plato talks about as the intelligibles, I believe, or talks about as the forms. He does talk about like beauty itself, not like one thought in the mind of God among other thoughts in the mind of God. These forms, if they're really superior to us and they have causal power independently of like the entirety of the second hypostasis, like if they're self-substantial, then they can't like fundamentally just depend on one mind that unites them. They have to have a kind of self-supporting hypostasis. So that's characteristic of the forms. I think fairly as described by Plato. They have to kind of stand in themselves. Yes, they reflect each other, but unless they're kind of ontologically independent and self-sufficient, then they don't meet the criteria that Plato gives for the nature of the forms.
So Plotinus says this in the Ninth Ennead about nous, that it's being itself, that it contains all beings. He says, intellect is the real beings, possessing them all not as if in a place, but as possessing itself and being one with them. All things are together there, and nonetheless they are separate. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would have thought reading that this is a more like unitary, like these are sort of ideas in the mind of God, but it is thought thinking itself, and it is this kind of unitary thing. I wouldn't have thought you needed that kind of separation of this kind of contemplation of the forms, like in nous. It seems to be much more unitary.
Well, there Plotinus even says they also somehow are separate. That's something that Proclus says about the nature of the forms. Not only are they integrated together more than souls are capable of integrating together with each other, the forms are more integrated together, they're also more distinct. What they are independently is an exemplary form of identity. They're more unique than you or I. So if they weren't superlative in that category of distinctness and uniqueness, they wouldn't have that attribute that we're looking for in a form. Like, what is a form? It's that the one in the many that we're looking for to explain common properties that things have. So if they weren't like eminently distinct from one another and self-substantial, like if they were one part, inexorably just one part of a broader network, or a broader mind, then, you know, you'd always, for any explanation, you'd always have to invoke all the forms, in a sense. And in a sense, that is true. And like, I'm not saying that it is not the case that there is a mental unity to the second hypostasis. I do think there is, but these distinctions within it are appropriate. And I think the demiurgic consciousness or intelligence is distinct from the kind of less active consciousness implicit in being itself. Like, the principle of intelligibility is different than the principle of intellectual reflection. At least we can distinguish them. And so I don't want to absolutize these distinctions, and we should take them all with a grain of salt, but I think there's something to be gained by being able to identify particular intelligible forms and then talking about how they are combined in a particular intellectual act of a particular kind of divine consciousness. And if we blend it all together, some fine distinctions no longer become possible. Also, for the sake of later Neoplatonists, like the grounds of worship of particular aspects of divinity is diminished, and they might as well just be monotheists in an overt sense.
Mm-hmm. So, as far as how the hypostases relate to each other, so there's kind of an internal and external activity of each one. Like, intellect or nous's internal activity would be contemplation of the one, right, the higher hypostasis. And then the external activity, the kind of downward looking aspect, if you want to use that analogy, would be that intellect, nous, the realm of being, provides the images, the forms for the third hypostasis, which is the world soul. So intellect needs the one as the cause of its being, but you could also say I mean, it wouldn't be proper to say the one needs intellect, but like the purpose of nous, of intellect for the one, is so that there can be anything at all with an intelligible structure. So the first hypostasis, the one, allows there to be anything at all. It's, you know, this principle of integration, the good. The second hypostasis provides the intelligible structures, that's being, intellect. And then the third hypostasis is the world soul, which is an interesting one to cover. So that's allowed to emanate due to the intelligibility provided by the second hypostasis. But that's what allows for the world soul. But what is kind of the purpose of the world soul? I guess it would be that the second hypostasis is kind of static, right? It's just, you know, like we were talking about, sort of thought thinking itself. It's these perfect intelligible structures. So the third hypostasis, soul, is posited to talk about change and order in nature. Is that correct?
Yeah, there is no time in the second hypostasis. Time begins with the third hypostasis. So souls, I would say souls generally are the third hypostasis. The world soul is the principal soul, just like being is the principal form. All other souls depend upon the world soul, and all souls measure time. That is what they do. That is how they energize. So there's another distinction that traces all the way back up to the monad and the indefinite dyad again. The monad is the aspect of essence, seminally, because it's super essential itself. The monad isn't an essence, but it is, in a sense, a principle of having an essence. All lower things.
I think a good analogy here for people to conceive it. Plotinus uses this analogy that the good is the center of a circle, and the nous is an unmoving circle around the good, the one, and then soul circles nous and is aspiring to be like nous, to return to nous. So I guess another good way to conceive it would be like the good, or the one, is like the sun, and you know, the nous would be like a planet that orbits the sun, that gets its light from the sun. And then I guess you could say soul would be like the moon, that has like kind of the reflection of light. That makes that intelligible, right?
Yeah, sure, for sure. So just to finish this one thought on the monad, indefinite dyad, the monad is the principle of essence, the indefinite dyad is the principle of energy or activity. So the forms have their essence in eternity and their energy in eternity. They measure as wholes eternity. That is what they do, and it's all within the eternal. Souls have their essence in eternity. All souls have an eternal essence, and their energy is in time, and they are measures of time. And different souls have different kind of time spans that they measure. So the highest soul, the time that the world soul measures is infinite time, perpetuity, or per duration. Lower souls have a kind of shorter wavelength of their cycle of what they measure. So, and I do think there's a necessity of soul and of time, because let's use an analogy of like a genius philosopher who writes a bunch of things and has this beautiful philosophical system in his mind. No matter how comprehensive his view is and how well he captures the nature of reality, there will always be additional truths about his system of thought that we can have by kind of circling around him in the same way. We can characterize the thought of a great philosophical genius in a multi-aspectual way and capture his influences and not just his nature as it is in itself. Or for anything, this is really the case. You know, the form of the animal, you know, essentially in itself contains all of that which is intelligible in animal nature, in all lower things. It contains the real, but what it doesn't contain is all of the kind of fleeting admixtures of that which is real and that which is unreal. You know, sometimes people characterize the world of generation as though it's wholly illusory, like it's a kind of Buddhist Maya doctrine. And that's close to it, but what is real in the world of generation is what is derived from the forms. It is what is eternal and intelligible in things, that is truly real about them. But there is a further reality that we experience and can only be experienced through time as we move between different aspects of intelligibility. The intelligibles are what they are. They contain their fullness in themselves. They never depart from it. And so in a way, they're ignorant about what it would be like to lose that eternal abiding, to lose that omniscience. It's like, you know, a thought experiment with God. God could know everything. Does God know exactly what it's like not to know everything? And isn't that another form of knowledge? In order for then God to have like the fullest kind of omniscience, God would have to have the ability to temporarily forget his omniscience and engage in ignorance so that he knows that experience. Of course, once recollected back together into that full eternal omniscience, the reality of time is, you know, it's seen to be illusory as it is, but unless that illusory process of generation and the measuring of time through souls takes place, then there are certain aspects of being that just won't be captured. So I think that's the necessity of it.
So, at the most basic level, what would be the Platonic definition of soul? Like, is it just, are you identifying it just with the, the fact that there's a center of subjective experience that carries through time? Is that what we're identifying as soul, and there's an aspect of it, you know, in being aware and having that consciousness that's and intellect in the eternal forms that's in the hypostasis above it? Or what's like the sort of simple Platonic definition of soul?
Well, the term is suke, and I'd say that all souls have an essence which reflects the being of all the forms in a signature way. Just like the being of each individual form is characterized by the way in which all of the other forms are kind of combined in it, and by the way in which all subordinate beings participate in it. Similarly, a soul's essence is characterized by the combination of the reflections of these forms. So this is a kind of confusing point, because Proclus and other later Neoplatonists will say that we don't actually have the forms themselves in our minds. The soul's essence contains images of the forms. And that does make sense, that in order for the forms to be independent, there has to be some kind of separation from their participant in some sense to have that aspect of independence. And yet they are in their participants, in that their images, their emanations are there in us. So it's the same way that the emanation of forms works with other things in the mundane realm. Our essence eternally captures a reflection, the truest reflection in the mundane world of the forms. They're all there in our mind. The Stoics call this the koinai anoi, the common ideas, or the spermatikos logos. There's different terms for it, but this is the way in which the essence of the soul encapsulates the nature of the forms. There's a unique kind of spectral analysis for each soul. You know, there's a way in which we combine all of the forms. And then our souls are distinguished also by what suspends from them. So the kinds of bodies that are associated with a given soul, the kinds of pneumatic bodies, the kinds of activities that the soul will engage in, those seminally are contained in the essence. So there is the way in which you combine the forms that you participate of, in a reflection in your essence, and then that essence is also characterized at the same time by the way in which your causal powers sit in potentia. What you might do as that soul is, in a certain sense, a defining feature of you. And then obviously your energy is in time. So the ability to kind of move between the forms, dianoetic thought as opposed to pure noesis, is characteristic of souls. There are a few defining features of souls that are given. And I think the equivocation between these different characterizations is important. So one characterization of soul is that it's on the level of the mathematicals. So mathematical forms are subordinate to the forms themselves. And what the soul is similar to mathematical forms. So if you have any mathematical system, somehow in potentia, it contains all of the possible derivations that could come out of it. Like the algebra. All possible algebraic operations are there seminally in the laws of algebra. So like the laws of algebra are equivalent to what is our essence, and then all the particular algebraic operations is equivalent to our energies. So there is that mathematical equivalence. There's also an equivalence to music, and music is essentially a mathematical type of thing. And I think that is a specification beyond just math in general that's important, because a property of music is that it always involves ratios. And souls also are always kind of what they are based on the way in which they reflect those around them. So it's a harmony that constitutes the soul in a certain sense. In the Phaedo, one of the suggestions about the nature of the soul is that it's like the harmony that exists on a lyre, or I think they say Cathara. So the harmony there is said to be kind of emergent to emanate from the instrument itself, and if you smash the instrument, then the harmony is destroyed. And so then they dismiss this harmony aspect. But I think this does reveal a true Platonic doctrine, and Plato does this, I think, all the time. He'll set up an aspect of the truth in the voice of the antagonist, or the view that is shot down in the dialogue, but there is some truth to it. It's not that the soul is like an acoustic harmony that is dependent on the musical instrument that produces it. There's a difference, and this difference is explicit in Plato and the Republic. There's a difference between the acoustic harmony and then the intelligible harmony. And the soul is more like that intelligible harmony. So it's like math, it's like a harmony, and it's also essentially, Proclus says, a moral agent. It is characteristic of soul that it chooses between the better and the worse. So that capacity for choice is not just something that the soul does and some activity it has. It is part of its essence. To be a moral agent is to be a soul. And without time, you don't have that. So I think that also gives a certain moral necessity to the existence of souls. Like without souls, if it was just the first and second hypostases, no one would, in a sense, ever choose the reality that exists. Even if it's the best of all realities, it would be like a kind of automatic occurrence. You know, without souls making the active choice to return to the forms, then the being of the forms and the being of the one beyond the forms wouldn't be earned. It's like it's only through soul acting as that kind of reverting cycle at the largest scale. So you can have the one abiding, the forms kind of proliferating the types, the kinds, and then the soul allows for the broadest level return of all of this once it's variegated and there's non-being inserted and illusion inserted and falsehood inserted in all of the complex picture. Soul is there to choose what is right and steer that whole process back to its origin, and that brings this like kind of broadest integration that somehow paradoxically integrates what is unreal, what is like the falsehoods and moral failings that we experience. It brings what is unreal back into the full picture so that you don't have this like kind of cartoonish static like realm of perfect forms that people often think of as a kind of caricature of Platonism. but I think it's more than that.
Yeah, so as far as so the third hypostasis is soul, but there's a distinction. Like there's two phases of soul. There's the all soul or the world soul, which kind of governs the universe, and then there's individual souls. But what's the right way to think of that all soul? Like, does that have its own individuality in the sense that it's kind of like an interventionist God that is kind of partaken in time and good and evil? Or is it more like this kind of, maybe a more kind of pantheist aspect where it's like it's kind of a collective conscious of it's a kind of it's kind of universal aspect of all of the individual souls? Like what's the right way to think of that relation?
I think both work. Just like the cells in your body have a certain degree of independent will, but the sum total of all the activity leads to this one consciousness. Of course, I think that's backwards. It's not that the parts create the emergent whole, it's that the form of the whole allows for the existence of the parts, just like the world soul. We could think of it as like an emergent amalgam of all of the lower consciousnesses that fill the universe and their kind of summit and wholeness. But really, it's that this world soul has to be there as an integrating feature of the cosmos, that which holds the cosmos together, in order then that individuated consciousness can exist. So the world soul also has this aspect of a moral agent. It's just that it always chooses the best.
Is there an aspect, like I'm just thinking of Alfred North Whitehead and process philosophy. Like he started this branch of process theology where like he had an immanent aspect of God that like partook in good and evil, and basically the purpose of this God was kind of to direct individual consciousnesses or individual souls towards the right choices, towards the good, while maintaining an aspect of their free will. So it was this kind of conscious creative agent, like creating in time, directed towards an end, but not all powerful, but sort of working through us. So is that an aspect of the world soul where it's kind of trying to direct individual souls toward their good and towards the good?
Yeah, I would say so. This is related to the idea of providence, right? So, and also the idea of fate. Fate is sometimes, misunderstood as like a fatalism or like your destiny is foretold kind of thing. Fate is really more like karma in Hinduism, or kind of like just the laws of physics. It's what coordinates disparate events or discrete events in space and time. So fate is kind of the action at the level of the world soul, acting as a whole, coordinating all of the events that take place within it. Now, that is the highest level soul, and so its moral judgment is going to be the best, and so fate will act, the laws of nature that governed by the world soul will act in the service of providence, which is ultimately the desire of the one to assimilate all things to its nature, to bring about unification, goodness. So the world soul is perfect in that regard, but all souls have a series of emanations themselves, right? Like our soul, our essential soul, what is most truly our soul, is not in our bodies and doesn't make contact with our bodies. It is exempt and independent. Just like within the forms, there is the form itself in itself that isn't directly participated. Instead, the form will send out a kind of copy of itself, an image of itself, a sequence of images of itself that degrade in terms of their faithfulness of the original identity, but become more manifold and therefore more apt to be assimilated to the extended nature of physical things. So the soul begins in this most unific, essential type that exists in eternity, and it emanates a series of images that are more extended until eventually it makes contact with the pneumatic body. So body exists on a spectrum, and this is really clear from the myth from the Gorgias. At the end of the Gorgias, there's this myth that we don't live on the surface of the earth. We're actually kind of in one big depression, the Mediterranean basin and the surrounding areas, among like a great number of other huge basins. And he talks about how things are on the surface, the actual surface. It's more like what Aristotle talks about, like ether is the air up there, and the air to us is kind of like their water. So there is this gradation within bodily nature as well. The more elevated bodily natures, and then the more, more corporeal and material, more weighed down. So there is the kind of summit of the bodily nature that makes contact with the lowest aspect of soul. And that takes place with the pneumatic vehicle. And that, I think, is better characterized as spirit. I think that's what is being gotten at with the translation of thumos, or like spirited emotion, as spirited emotion. Because intellect, the top part of our soul, of course, we have intellect, thumos, and then epithumia, or appetite. Appetite is like kind of just the dispositions of the body as reflected into soul. Thumos is where the body kind of makes contact with that spirit. The intellect is more, reaching up to the second hypostasis itself, or at least images of the second hypostasis primarily. But that spirit is the midterm, the middle point between the nature of soul and the nature of body. There's also another midpoint that maybe can be identified with that spirit, which is phusis, or nature. So the world soul governs, you could say, a world spirit that characterizes the laws of nature, and that's the kind of vehicle that the world soul uses to interface with time. So yeah, that's it seems complex at first, but it works according to the same logic kind of at each step. And it does more or less, I think, make sense at each step. The forms, or the universals and things, would have to have this property. They have to have an exempt aspect and a participated aspect in order to get over the problem that, Zeno raises, or actually it might be Parmenides, in the dialogue, the Parmenides, the third man argument. And also how that participation takes place. Is it that the forms are distributed and some things receive some of the form? Are the forms only in particulars, or how does that work? The late Neoplatonist answer is there is an exempt aspect and there is a participated aspect. I think that holds for soul as well. So there's the exempt, eternal world soul, and then there's its images in a sequence of gradation until it finally meets body. So that also leaves room for the possibility that there are images of the world soul that act, in some sense, in an incomplete way. So there can be like spirits, daimonical entities that aren't completely benevolent, because there is always this sequence of less and less faithful images of the thing itself. So you have true souls that always energize morally. You have souls that fail occasionally. And between them, you have souls that always make the good decision, but sometimes are subject to consequences in the world itself. And then you have souls that make mistakes and are subject to consequences. And then you have, beneath that level, things that are hardly even souls, like animal life at its lowest forms, or plant life. It's like it's still making contact with soul, but in a much less integrated sense than we make contact with soul, until you get to the point where there's this kind of in-between and not quite living entities. Like, what do you call a virus? Is a virus a living thing? Does a virus have a soul or not? It's a little ambiguous. The same thing applies even in the henads. There are the true unities, and then there are like the aspects of unities that are reflected here in falsehoods. Like, even falsehoods have a semblance of a unity. So those shadow images are present here and account for a lot of like the negative things that happen, in a sense. So I think what Whitehead is talking about there, you could maybe account for by this gradation of images from the world soul, some of which may be less than perfectly moral.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, it can get quite technical, but I mean the basic principle is that if we're talking about the hypostases and just generally like Platonic ontology, everything has its origin in the first principle, which is perfectly one, perfect unity, the ineffable, and there is some kind of activity which is difficult to wrap our heads around, I guess, and subject of a lot of discussion. But there's some kind of creative outflow that penetrates the universe all the way down. But it does create certain relative dualities, sort of as it emanates. And the first duality is found in the intellect. And this is why you have to have the principle beyond intellect, because within intellect there's, further to be a form, there's a knower and a known. So that can't be the ultimate principle. But there's like this double aspect to emanation, where there's this creative, indefinite outflow of energy from the first principle. But there's also, as it outflows, there's an awareness of having left an origin, and so there's this sort of longing for return. So there's this desire to turn around and sort of contemplate our origin. And this happens through the light of the one, or the good, right? And it's kind of interesting. I mean, you touched on it a little bit earlier. The three hypostases kind of give us, it kind of gives us a way of understanding the different ways that people do and have conceived the divine, right? Like with the world soul, it's a God that partakes in good and evil. It's like, the kind of personal God of petition and of prayer. And you could think of nous, of intellect, as the more divine heavenly abode, the more sort of pantheist or panentheist sort of all-embracing conception of things. And then I guess the one would be the kind of God of the mystics, the ineffable, the subject of negative theology, like Meister Eckhart's Godhead. He made a distinction between God and the Godhead, which is absolutely ineffable, absolute nothingness, or para Brahman in Hinduism. So it does give us a way of making sense of, it is ultimately one divine reality, it is one God, and like I said, Plotinus, Plato seem to use God at different times for nous, or for the one. But in the way that this emanation functions, it can kind of explain how there can be like a personal and impersonal and ineffable aspects, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's room for all of these conceptions of divinity, and it's related to that idea of the series. There's a ray connecting these aspects of divinity from the one through the demiurge, through the world soul, and then even more specifically in individual exemplary souls that we can follow here, both that incarnate in bodies and those that don't, right? Like we have our individual presiding daimon, which is a type of soul, but it's really a type of our own soul, and we would call it a spirit because it doesn't itself have a body, but that represents, like, in a sense, the summit of our own soul that remains exempt, and yet we can kind of make contact and appeal to it and receive help from it. And like Socrates heard the voice of his daimon, and that's partly why he was like a moral exemplar himself, because he had this strong connection to the summit of his own being. Now, there's two other aspects that should be discussed, is like where the nature of the self sits in all of this. And I think it's oversimplistic to identify the individual identity with the individual's soul. I think the language is ambiguous in Plato himself, but the soul is characterized not necessarily as something that you are, but as something that you have. And that's certainly explicitly the case when it comes to the relation between the intellectual soul, which is what makes us most human, and then our spirited and appetitive natures. So we have those latter things, and they are kind of tools of the intellectual soul. Within the intellectual soul, though, are we that soul nature, or are we a higher intellectual type or a higher unity that brings it all together? there is room for a kind of full-on henosis concept of mystic contemplation. It just depends on where we situate that nature of the self. Proclus says very explicitly that all souls exist perpetually. So they measure time in these given cycles, and they will continue doing that. The question, though, is what you really are, like what you most essentially are, does that always necessarily reside in the same soul? Or can that soul continue doing what it's doing, and meanwhile that core identity either sits within it, descends beneath it, or rises above it? That's not explicit in Neoplatonism or in Plato himself, but it's an interesting question, which if you take that move that I kind of intimated at, you could get a little bit closer to more of a, Advaita Vedanta perspective on this whole scheme. But we also missed the other aspect, which is like the nature of body and matter, which doesn't need that much time to explain it fully. Bodies aren't in their own hypostasis. There isn't a corporeal hypostasis because they're not self-subsistent. Bodies don't exist on account of their own being. Souls do. Souls have an eternal hypostasis that cannot be taken away. Bodies are ephemeral, they come and go, and they're dependent on soul. Without soul, there would be no body. So right there, you have a form of idealism, not the kind of highest level idealism that's possible, more of this Advaita Vedanta perspective, but just kind of a basic, material bodies are dependent on a mental substrate kind of view of things. And then beneath that, matter doesn't exist in its own hypostasis because it doesn't have an existence in itself. Matter is privatory. Matter is the absence of form. So matter kind of itself doesn't exist. The influence of matter, however, does, and that is really a negative influence to chip away at the integrity of bodies, the form that is in bodies. Between body and matter, I'll just say the one last aspect of this that doesn't have its own hypostasis, but is kind of an inevitable part of things. Plato characterizes very briefly in the Theaetetus, but I think it's a core concept in his worldview, and it comes back up in the Timaeus, which is kind of equivalent to what we would talk about as quantum foam. It's sort of like the most basic and unstructured activity of body. So complex bodily activities are unique, but there's kind of a capacity of the static state that just is the least ordered, chaotic swirling of body possible. So that, I think, is an interesting concept to think about, at least. And it reminds one of the waters that God is, the deep that God is sitting in the face of before creation. And it's referenced in the Timaeus in a very similar vein. That, though, isn't its own hypostasis. Matter isn't its own hypostasis. Body, that chaotic substrate, and matter are like the very bottom of this spectrum. None of them has reality, but body is more real. The chaos is more real than matter, and matter is kind of in itself unreal. So that gives you the full spectrum. I think this is a pretty nice overview. Anything else you think we should hit before we end?
No, I think that's good. I think some of that stuff might be a good topic of itself. I think a show just on the Platonic conception of matter would actually be interesting. But yeah, I think this was pretty comprehensive. It was a good first show. We will be back with more of these. Yeah, I enjoyed recording this. Enjoyed hearing your breakdown of this, Eric. And yeah, thanks for everyone that tuned in. And yeah, we'll be back again with more Platonism. Thanks, Eric.
Awesome. Had fun. Thanks, Keith.